to the last rack of this year and the last rack for a few months. So we'll make the most of our time. Great to see everyone. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping, talk about how we're going to spend our time together, and then we'll move into the conversation. So just as a reminder, as folks join, if you could change your name and affiliation for your Zoom, and if you want to, you can hover over your own image or box, click on the three dots, and that can change name and affiliation. Also, just reminder that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. So for those in the audience, you can't participate, but you can listen in to the conversation. As we get going, and before we walk into the agenda, I want to do a roll call for our RAC members, alphabetical order. So I should give you an indication of when I'll be calling on you. We're going to start with Alan Lazo.
Good afternoon, all.
Good afternoon. Alan Hines.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. Anna Molina. Ann Kelly. Ariel Nelson. Alexander Ring. I know you're on the phone. Yep.
Yep, I'm here. I'll be on video shortly.
Good, thank you. Becky Baxter. Benjamin Gurwitz.
Here.
Thank you. Brandon Persinger. Ann Kelly, I just saw you join. I see you. You're still connecting, but we'll mark you as here. Brandon Schrader. Brian Rankin.
I'm here.
Yep, thanks, Brian. Brock.
Here.
You, yep. Sarah Phipps. I saw it. Sarah. You know. Chantal Avenso.
Afternoon.
Thank you. Corey Harlan.
Here.
Thank you, Corey. Dana Hicks. David Madison.
Here. Good afternoon.
Afternoon. Alyssa Gertler. Garrett Pryor. Garrett Stevenson. Holly Kearns.
Here.
Jessica Blakely. Jim Johnson. Julia Metz. I saw you. Yep, there you are. Thanks, Julia. Kelly Glenn. Kathy Wild, I see you connecting to audio. Let's mark Kathleen here. Kelly Hart.
Here.
Thank you. Lindsay Hutchinson.
Here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Lucia Ramirez.
Here.
Thank you. Matt Cunningham. Mary Kyle McCurdy. Megan Bolton. Mercedes Elzalde. Michael Rock. Miranda Bateshell. Rachel Moribidu.
Here.
Thank you. Ryan Vandenhuff. Richard Rogers. Samantha Bayer. Sean Hobbs Waters. Shane Kwiatkowski. I saw you, Shane. I can see your name, Shane, so I know you're here. Thank you. Shannon Vilhauer.
Here.
Thank you, Shannon. Ted Reed.
Hello.
Hey, Deb. Tara Wilcoxon,
Good afternoon.
afternoon, and Victor Saldana.
Hello.
Hello. Let me go back. If I missed you, can you just say hello?
Wild, hello.
Yep, hello, we got you. I'd seen you connecting to audio, Kathleen, so thank you for that. Anna Molina, I thought I saw you just join. Welcome.
Yes,
And-
I'm here.
Yep, good to see you, Sarah.
Hi, apologies, some technical difficulties.
All right. Did we miss anybody else?
I'm not sure if you got me and Kelly.
I did, and you were connecting to audio, but I saw you
Oh.
coming. Thank you for naming
Thank
it.
you.
Okay, do a last call for anybody who I missed for roll call. Okay, well, let's keep going. So I'm going to walk through the agenda for today. It's a shorter meeting than usual, but just as exciting as our typical content. So we'll, as we always do, start with the racial equity framework. We'll hear some opening remarks, et cetera, from Ethan, but we'll start with the racial equity framework, again, foundational to the conversations that we hope to continue having. You'll get an update on the Land Conservation and Development, or LCDC, adoption hearing of the rules that we collectively have been working on for some time, kind of phase one, and then we'll get into the meat and kind of teeing up the conversation that we'll be coming back to at our next rack and working through 2025 on the housing capacity and urbanization update and kind of our first foray. You've been getting updates, of course, from CowTech or from the Housing Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee over our time together, but this will be kind of a pivot point to really dive into that conversation, and then we'll do some closing and get you out of here by 3:00. So just a couple quick pieces, reminders. And again, you all have been doing a really great job of kind of sharing the space and giving good input. We'll continue to ask you to seek to learn and understand. Right? We're able to have discussion and deliberation, but really trying to understand others' perspectives is critical for our conversations, to maintain a respectful, candid, constructive, moving towards solutions when we can, resolving differences, identifying and finding common ground, being able to have these conversations in the room, and that's not necessarily outside, and then avoiding surprises. And with that, thank you, Ellen, for adding to the chat. As a reminder, you can always email housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov, including ONA rulemaking, RAC, either for DLC staff only or for public comment. Moving forward, I'm going to pass it to Ethan to provide some open remarks and really set a vision for how we're going to use our time together.
Thanks, Ben, and hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Stuckmeyer. I'm the manager of the Housing Division at DLCD. Like Ben mentioned in the beginning of this meeting, welcome to the final Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting of 2024. We've got some things to kind of debrief with you all on related to the adoption meeting that LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, held last Thursday, when they took action to adopt the kind of first phase of the ONA rulemaking scope, the rules related to under the NAPTAC and the HOTAC scope. We'll talk about that in a little bit of detail coming up. But then we also will shift the majority of the conversation today towards the capacity and urbanization work in 2025, as we're talking about the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rulemaking in kind of two different phases. We've really truly turned the page, or we are currently turning the page of from phase one into phase two. So we'll kind of talk about what that scope of work kind of looks like as it relates to the capacity and urbanization work in 2025. And then we'll have some discussion with RAC members about those topics and that process as it relates to the capacity and urbanization work. In the end, we'll talk about some next steps, including where we go from here in terms of the other items related to the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, particularly the Housing Actions Work Group and that discussion throughout 2025. So that's an overview of our agenda for today. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and we'll talk about we'll kind of have a good kind of queuing up conversation for 2025. So that's really the kind of emphasis of the meeting today. So thanks for the time, Ben. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. So Anita, I want to invite you in, and again, this grounding for the racial equity framework is also something we'll be coming back to later in the meeting. So this will be a good reminder for how we can approach our conversations. Anita.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. Anita Keelani Yap with Multicultural Collaborative. Before I get started, we want to make sure that as we have discussion, I've reminded folks before, but not to have discussion in the chat. So if you have anything you'd like to place in the chat during discussion, you can send it to me directly and I'll make sure that gets addressed. So just to kind of keep the conversation in the room. So please do that as a direct message or a chat to me. Introducing this racial equity framework for decision making. Again, the LCDC developed this framework for staff to address for all rulemaking and projects that DLCD undertakes. And so it has these 4 different, I guess, 8 different, excuse me, kind of titles and questions about racial equity. And those of you may have seen that before. But as part of the last portion of the rulemaking, there was an evaluation about how this rulemaking meets each of these criteria. And so it talks about historical inequities, benefits and burdens, data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, accountability, restorative justice, decision-making, measuring and evaluating outcomes, and continuous improvement. So I know we're going to be talking about urbanization and capacity, and I think from my experience as well, having worked in local government, UGB expansions and urbanization are important to consider in these sort of things. So we're hoping to have some really good, productive conversations with the RAC so we can also address these issues before the commission as the rules come before them later next year. So we will remind you this probably every meeting. We're going to have the beginning and the end, and we will have some leading questions because we're really interested in having this conversation with the RAC to make sure that we can address these questions that the commission would like to know. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. And again, just Anita said, we'll be not just kind of embedding this into all of our conversations as we have, but be really being intentional about the type of questions that we're asking you all to reflect on, deliberate, and provide policy direction for. So with that, Ethan, why don't you provide some reflection on the hearing from last week?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So like we mentioned, or as we've kind of been talking with this group about for over a year at this point, we knew that December 5th was a big day on the calendar in terms of the action that the Land Conservation and Development Commission would take to meet its statutory deadlines of adopting rules related to the Needs and Production Technical, or within the scope of the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee and the Housing Acceleration Technical Advisory Committee. And if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So commission did kind of just that when they convened last week. The rules, I think, were kind of easily grouped into 3 different buckets of rulemaking, or 3 major topics as it relates to the scope of those 2 technical advisory committee, those being related to the contextualized housing need, housing production strategies, and the housing acceleration program. There was also some, what I think we could classify as some miscellaneous amendments to Division 8 that were included in there related to the definitions, some of the adoption deadlines when it comes to the housing capacity analyses and housing production strategies, and then also some of the midterm reporting elements of that. When the commission was deliberating on those rules, I mean, I see Vice Chair Lazo's here. You can feel free to I would invite him in to join in on or amend my statements here. But the discussion was really centered around the importance of balancing this work that's directed in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program through, the implementation of statewide planning goal 10 and the ability of local governments to do the work in the time that's necessitated under the program, and balancing the elements of this program with time and resource constraints at the local government level, and also considering the kind of data environment in which we currently operate, and how that data environment is constantly shifting, but we have a set of words and sentences and paragraphs and sections in rule that are somewhat static to and unresponsive to that data environment in some manner. And so to kind of consider some of those pieces and kind of the iterative nature of this rulemaking process and the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program generally, I think the commission has articulated some interest in, coming back or at least considering how implementation happens at the local government level. And as local governments are having those conversations and doing some of this work that's articulated and described in these rules, that there's an opportunity to refine and adapt and have those conversations in a little bit more of a collective sense, so that the program really is running in the way that it's truly intended, both by HB 2001 and by the commission. But on that particular piece there, I mean, Vice Chair Laza, I don't know if I'm kind of springing this on you at the last moment, but if you have anything to add, feel free.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, no, I think you captured it pretty well. I think there are a few things I'd say. I think one is, I didn't get an opportunity to congratulate you and your team for this really monumental work in reframing the work around Goal 10 housing planning. So congratulations, and really thank you for all the hard work that you all have done. And I think there was the amendments to the Goal 10 rules passed unanimously at the commission, and I think it was really a recognition, as I said at the time, that this is the best way forward for us as a state. This is the role that the agency plays in moving us past this housing crisis, and so it really spoke to how important this work has been and continues to be. I think, as Ethan captured, there really is this concern about capacity at the local level. And I think the commission is very, very committed to watching this, how it plays out, gets implemented, and reiterating through this to make sure that everyone is being successful in this. So I think that's really a critical piece of what we talked about there, and a recognition for the fact that we've heard from local jurisdictions. We're hearing and listening to the capacity issues that they're talking about, and we're looking for solutions to that. But again, I think we should all be proud and grateful for the work that's gone into this moment in moving forward. This three-legged stool of Goal 10 housing planning now into the future.
Yeah, thanks for those reflections, Vice Chair. And the kind of the next steps on these draft rule, or these now adopted rules, is that they become effective on January 1st of 2025. So in short order here, and we are, like I've mentioned and has been said in this meeting, we are kind of turning the page on this rulemaking. And with these rules as they're adopted, we continue to have that conversation with those in the back of our minds of, all right, we've already taken this action, but there is steps to be taken at this point now, moving forward on things related to the capacity and urbanization work, things related to the adoption ready actions, and fitting all of these pieces together. But we've really, as a group here, and with the adoption of by LCDC, have taken really maybe even more than one big step forward in the implementation of ONA, and we've got still yet more to go, which leads me to the next piece here, which is LCDC took two actions at their meeting last week. The first was to adopt the rules as they were proposed, but they also took action to amend the Rulemaking Advisory Committee charge, the charge of this group here. Not to amend the language that was already in there, but to add additional language in the charge to kind of lead us all in the direction that we will be going in 2025 with some more guidance and direction. So I will read this, bear with me, but I will read this piece here because it is important on where we go as a rulemaking advisory committee into 2025. So LCDC took action last week to add this section into the rulemaking charge. Develop a clear compliance pathway for local governments through the housing production strategy and housing acceleration programs, utilizing program design tools like safe harbors or minimum standards in furtherance of affirmatively furthering fair housing, increased housing production affordability and choice, and reliability in program outcomes for local governments. And so this really ties into the work of the Housing Actions Work Group, which again is not the primary focus of the meeting today, but as we are moving into that work, that work group will meet for the first time on the 18th of December, so next week, to get oriented to the scope of work that work group is going to be focused on in 2025. And generally that includes building out the suite of these adoption ready actions that we've talked about in this 2024 rulemaking, which is section 0210 of the adopted rules, if you're curious and seeing what that states. But really it's to build out this universe of these steps that local governments can take through either through safe harbors, through minimum standards, and also including guidance and resources in both the housing production strategy portion of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program and connecting that thread, pulling that thread all the way through to the Housing Acceleration Program. So this amended charge really does kind of set the stage for what the Housing Actions Work Group will be focused on in 2024 or 2025 rather. But Ben, I think at this point, happy to ask or answer any questions about particularly number 2. Number 1, I think we'll hold questions to be really more just like clarifying questions and not for the purposes of opening up more discussion on rules that have already been adopted. So.
Right. Well, with that direction, Brock, jump in.
Yeah, and Commissioner Lazo, I thank you so much for your comments during the rulemaking. Really appreciated those, and it's been great working with you through this process. And I want to specifically thank you, and as well as Commissioners Warren and Thompson for your comments that you made when adopting the change to the charge here. That while it says develop, what you guys had stated is that it was your intent these be explored. Right. And so guidance materials, obviously, those are going to be developed, but particularly as it was related to minimum standards and safe harbors, that was a direction to explore those opportunities or those possibilities and not specifically to adopt those guaranteed as a part of that process. Correct?
Yeah, thanks, Brock. Yeah, I think the work of the Housing Actions work group does include consideration of, all of the tools in the toolbox, which, includes things like safe harbors, minimum requirements, guidance, the whole spectrum of things. And so in working through, where that lands in 2025, we will overturn all of those rocks and come out the other side with, a set of actions or regulatory environment that does meet the intent of both ONA, HB 2001, and of this rulemaking charge.
Thank you. Alan Hines.
Yeah.
I also wanted to confirm that this plan includes permit ready planning for accessibility, physical accessibility.
It's a good question, Alan. When I think it could, as part of the process for the housing actions work group. I think there's a exploration of, what the scope should actually include, and we'll dive into those topics on like what do the housing actions actually include in that orientation meeting next week and throughout the rest of the work group process. But permit ready plans for accessible dwellings, I think that's happening in a couple different arenas. So I think it's more of a matter of trying to figure out like where that actually lands and how all the pieces fit together. I don't know if that's a definitive answer to your question, though.
I just want to add to the blank. Can you use a different word? I just want to mention that I've spoken with some developers that are looking for different incentives to build accessible housing. And the permit ready plans could be a really nice incentive for developers. Good. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Alan. Any other clarifying questions? Okay, not seeing any. Thanks, Ethan. Congratulations on that phase one, and let's turn the page. So, Karen, I'm going to invite you in, and again, kind of acknowledging both Ethan's metaphor of turning the page, and also really just having this as our starting point for this broader conversation we'll be having over the next year. So, Karen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, if we could stay on this slide for a little bit, Ellen. I just want to thank our project team for being here today. Beth Goodman, Steve Faust, who have been key and instrumental in guiding this particular technical advisory committee. And then you all have heard from my own colleagues and teammates, Maddie Phillips and Jenna Hughes as well, who you will hear from later on. What we plan on doing this morning, or I guess it's this afternoon, what we plan on doing with y'all is a quick overview of how this particular set of rules or the subsequent set of rules fit into that broader ONA policy goals and objectives from House Bill 2001. We'd like to share with you a little bit about why these rules are part of the ONA package of policies. So we will articulate the problem statement as we see it, as we've heard it and interpreted it from our TAC members. We'll also outline the scope, various topics within our legislative directive and our commission charge. There's a lot of nuance and specificity, but we'll give you a brief and broad overview of these specific topics within and how those topics really respond to that legislative direction and the charge that was given to us by commission. Which Commissioner Lazo represents amongst his peers. So Ellen, I think I'm ready for that next slide, and we'll delve into what was the legislative direction, what is the legislative direction. You all have been talking a lot about needed housing, production strategies, and accountability or acceleration. And I think what I just wanted to note is whether we are discussing needed housing and the capacity of land within a UGB to provide for that needed housing, the strategies that will produce said housing, or even the measures to really understanding what are the barriers to this housing production. One thing that kept coming up, I think, in the years leading up to ONA or producing the recommendations report for the legislator was the need for coordinated public facilities. It just came up over and over. And hence this concept of development readiness had to be addressed. And so we'll share with you today what that means for this set of rules when we think about capacity and we think about housing production. But you see here on the slide, and you all are very familiar with the legislative direction from House Bill 2001 that led into this rulemaking, this body of work. All right, I can go on to that next slide. From the legislative direction, the commission provided this charge to staff in response to various sections of the bill, House Bill 2001. And it really, you can see in the commission's charge that it reflects what the legislative intent was, asking staff to really consider the relationship between goal 10 and goal 14 and the rules within, to both affirmatively further fair housing, but really to facilitate as well climate friendly, climate resilient, and affordable housing. How do we respond to housing need? It asks staff to take into account, you know, both these goals of goal 14 and goal 14 to provide accountability mechanisms to really address housing production, affordability, and choice, whether that's within an existing UGB or thinking about UGB expansions. And then reasonable actions to address housing capacity and development readiness as we think about land that's brought in and how does that land produce housing. All right, so I will lay out in this next slide kind of how this process works, maybe how it's integrated, how it's sequential for cities that are embarking on these processes, and then how that sort of sequentially laid out worked in rulemaking. So goal 10 and goal 14, I'm going to read a little bit of this, so bear with me just a tad here. Goal 10 asks local governments and their planning staff to provide for housing needs of all community members in the state of Oregon. And therefore, our land inventories really, and our plans, our land inventories and our land use plans should be structured in a way that encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing at units, the number of units, and at price ranges and rent levels, which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of our Oregon households, and to allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. Ooh, that is a heavy lift, but that is the requirements under goal 10. And goal 14 really can get distilled down to, within that urban growth boundary, does the city have enough land zoned to sufficient capacity to accommodate 20 years of housing need? And so this is really the system we're working within. And I think Maddie in a couple minutes will delineate, well, what's problematic about that? This is the system we've always known. This is what we operate under. It feels and sounds very comprehensive. But in our discussions with our TAC, I think we have come to a place where we can really articulate for you all what we're solving for and then share with you that problem statement. So I'll go on to my next slide, and this will look very familiar to all of you. If I'd taken a little bit more time, I might have restructured it. You noticed the previous diagram kind of runs us through the sequential of, you get a housing need. How are you going to respond to that housing need? You have the capacity to respond to that housing need. And then if you don't, what are some production strategies, or what are some typical measures under goal 10, efficiency measures, or measures under goal 14 for a UGB amendment? And so I think, you know, if I take just a bit more time, I might look at capacity and urbanization as coming right after this light blue. You have this box of needs and production, and this light blue of what are my community's housing needs? How are we going to respond to it? What are we going to do about it? There are tools and incentives, strategies and actions we can put into place, including goal 10 actions and strategies. Goal 10 and goal 14. And then once you've started to implement some of this, what barriers have you addressed? What barriers remain? How do we understand that? What are tools and incentives to accelerate housing production? And so we think about this sequentially of how a city is going about housing planning and housing actions and strategy in their community. But then we think about it in rulemaking, how we necessitated a process for us to develop these rules. And it began with those rules of needs and production. It sort of jumped concurrently in parallel. It included the rules for housing acceleration and accountability. And then what you're hearing about today and what will come is the commission's adoption for rules around how do you assess your land inventories and the capacity on that land? How do you determine if you've done enough land efficiency measures? And how do you know if you need a UGB amendment? And so, when I articulated goal 10 and goal 14 for you, there is a very comprehensive, long-standing process. And I think it behooves us to really think about what is missing in that process, what might not be working in that process, and what are we solving for. So I would like to turn it over to my teammate and colleague, Maddie, to articulate for you how we have understood the problem statement and how it's been discussed with our TAC members.
Thank you, Cotton. Good afternoon, Rules Advisory Committee. My name is Madeline Phillips. Friends and colleagues call me Maddie, but my role is that I'm a part of the urbanization team, Cotton and Jenna included, and I am the public facilities planner within this group. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem statement. If you could advance the slide, Ellen, thank you. The problem that the urbanization team, who are leading the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee, is addressing is a multifaceted one. This very simple slide belies the complexity of our challenge. We are attempting to solve for existing challenges to land that's in growth boundaries. We are hoping to address perceptions around housing production solutions, particularly around what is the solution to the issue that we're in right now, which is a challenge of producing housing units on urbanizable land. And third, rulemaking to produce different results in the future. We hope that we won't have to come back and repair issues that exist in our current development landscape. In some cases, things like incomplete communities and the omission of certain affordability in certain areas of communities. What we hear constantly, just to start with that, perceptions around housing production solutions, is we hear we're in a housing crisis, so we need more land. Our technical advisory committee is addressing land that is added to a city's urban growth boundary, and we have to remember that urban growth boundaries extend well beyond city limits in some cases of cities, and often that land is at the fringe of undeveloped area. So it's not just in that close-in area, how can we add to that and add development opportunity to that, but it's areas beyond that at the edge of existing urban growth boundaries. So the urbanization team hopes that land eligible for urban development has a pathway to successfully producing housing units in a way that preserves opportunity for diverse income residents to live in complete communities, so that development that happens at farther out from the center of a community is not burdened by the need to make trips into the central city to achieve some of its daily needs, and that what gets built, what is urbanized, can support the values that we've espoused and discussed at length in this Rules Advisory Committee around livability, affordability, and choice. Within that set of values certainly is production of units, which is implied. Nearly all cities in Oregon have land in their urban growth boundaries available to be urbanized. That's one of the tenets of Goal 10. They count this land as housing capacity. So I'll run through a couple of vocabulary words that we'll start using a lot more as the Capacity and Urbanization team starts doing presentations to you all a little bit more frequently. But there are challenges to urbanizing that land that we hope our work will at least clarify pathways for. Right now, there are several areas that are gray areas or areas that are challenging for cities to move through, and relationships between different entities that we might hope to iron out. So the Capacity and Urbanization and Technical Advisory Committee has been diligently working through questions raised by you all and by TAC members and beyond. And we'll put up a slide, not yet though, that will show a couple of the comments that were garnered in some open discussions early on in our Technical Advisory Committee process that have caused cities uncertainty or have lacked clarity in, sometimes they're discovered through legal challenges, and we've begun discussions about the true barriers to developing land within cities' growth boundaries. Undeniably, we know that we've heard that the development dance of land use and the provision of public facilities doesn't always go as smoothly as we'd hoped. That speaks to some of our discussion around development readiness, achieving development readiness of existing land available as a step towards supporting cities as they evaluate their capacity for rural development, for residential development, excuse me, if warranted, and perhaps pursue process steps to modify or grow their urbanizable area. So we're hoping we're achieving clarity, certainty, and we're working through a lot of those gray areas that cause challenge or disconnection between the opportunity to develop into land that is available for that urbanizable opportunity. So some of the words you'll hear us say, and we'll go into much more detail in future meetings, but urban growth boundary expansion. When a city finds they don't have enough land to accommodate their identified housing need, they have to expand their urban growth boundary. That's part of the Goal 10 process. So you'll hear us talk about that. An alternative to that has been an urban growth boundary swap. When a city finds that the land within their boundaries have constraints to development, an option remains for that city to swap land out. And there are some rules to that that have been in existence for some time, but the use of them is becoming a little bit more focused. And we're talking about that at the technical advisory committee level that we'll share with you. A big topic and perhaps the defining term of the cow tax work is phantom capacity. Land that is counted as capacity for urban uses, in this case residential uses, that has not or is unlikely to produce housing at urban densities in the planning period. And lastly, for the sake of brevity, public facilities. When you think of public facilities, think of water, sewer, streets, and stormwater facilities. There are lots of other facilities that folks sometimes group in that public facilities topic, but we're talking about those that specifically speak to residential units and what it takes to connect those residential units to be occupied. Ellen, if you move on to the next slide, please. So the TAC around this time last year, our capacity and urbanization TAC opened up a Miro board, and on the left you'll see what we asked TAC members to describe as key outcomes. And those key outcomes, we've selected a few high level topics that you can read here that TAC members identified as critical outcomes of our process. And similarly on the right, you'll see a few selected policy tensions or challenges that folks identified in our initial exploration of the problem statement, why capacity and urbanization needs to take these steps, and what might we address and attempt to solve. And what you'll see here are some common themes around better understanding the criteria and or creating new rules to further explain those criteria, prioritization of the types of development that we might see beyond city limits or within city limits in infill capacity, but also beyond city limits into the growth boundary and how that happens. And some key policy tensions, why we're here. We know that there are a number of challenges that cities face in urbanizing areas into their growth boundary, into their identified growth boundaries, and or adding to them. You'll see that there are some exogenous pressures like the pressure of existing residents to resist change. There are process challenges like annexation of property from the growth boundary into the city. And there are other issues like finding funding to do necessary infrastructure improvements. So that provides you a quick overview of some of the work that we have been doing, some of the problems that we've tried to define and engage our technical advisory committee in. And we hope to bring a lot of the topic areas that I just described to you as a rulemaking advisory committee to better explain the conversation we've had with those folks and seek your input as we move through rulemaking work. So from here, I'll pass it over to Jenna, who's going to review the scope of some of our rulemaking work.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. And hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Hughes. I am a housing and growth management analyst with DLCD, and supporting the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee. So Maddie talked about a lot of the key issues and opportunities surrounding capacity and urbanization. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're aiming to address these key issues through the capacity and urbanization rulemaking. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the legislative direction and rulemaking charge that got in first introduced. And I want to call out some of the key principles and priorities of this work, which is laid out in sections 8 and 9 of House Bill 2001. The grayed out text here mostly relates to the rules that were just adopted. So we're really focused on the text in bold here. But some of the key principles are housing that is safe, accessible, affordable in the community of people's choice, building enough equitable housing, ensuring fair and equitable outcomes, environmental justice, climate resilience and opportunity, and that housing is not undermined by uncertainty or delay. And that's really a key one in this work. And, some of the key priorities here are also priorities of the entire rulemaking, but housing production, affordability, and choice, creating clarity and certainty for housing capacity analyses, and UGB or urban growth boundary amendments, as well as urban and rural reserves, and reducing analytical burden, increasing certainty, and facilitating the development readiness of land. So these are key priorities that are really guiding us in this work. Next slide, please. So based on that legislative direction, the LCDC rulemaking charge provides guidance to DLCD staff to faithfully implement the direction in consideration of these topics. Specific to capacity and urbanization, in bold on this slide, this includes the consideration of creating clarity and certainty to local governments in urbanization planning processes, which includes buildable land inventories, urban growth boundary amendments, urban and rural reserves, and coordinated public facilities and concept plans. And I will also just note that the deadline for adopting the rules related to capacity and urbanization is January 1st, 2026. So we get an extra year than the needs in production and acceleration folks. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to operationalize the legislative direction and LCDC rulemaking charge, the Housing Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee, or what we've been calling the CAUTAC, is the advisory body tasked with advising staff on the technical aspects of this work. So the key issues that we've been grappling with are refining buildable land inventory methodologies to provide certainty in assessing the capacity of lands. So for example, how to best measure constraints when it comes to natural resources or hazards. And really the goal here is to articulate a range of options for how to inventory land, and constraints and estimating capacity for cities of varying sizes or with varying contexts. So folks, cities on the coast may have totally different constraints than those in other parts of the state, for example. And the next major topic area that we've been grappling with is coordinating public facilities and concept planning to facilitate the development readiness of lands within existing UGBs, as well as those brought in to the UGB. And this is really to address the key problem that Maddie raised around phantom capacity and inadequate infrastructure. Sometimes we see scenarios where land is inside the urban growth boundary and it just sits vacant for years, sometimes decades. And so our focus is really determining methods and actions that integrate public facilities and land use planning to encourage development readiness and help ensure that cities' implementation plans are successful. And part of how this happens is through inventorying development ready land, which is a brand new element of the Goal 10 process and something that cities will be required to do at the same time that they're required to do a buildable lands inventory. And if there is not enough development ready land, they will need to take actions in their housing production strategy to prepare land for development. And then the third major topic that we're grappling with is creating clarity and certainty for UGB amendments and creating greater flexibility when it comes to land exchanges, sometimes called swaps, as well as urban and rural reserves. One thing I'll note is that a lot of our guidance on this topic is from the 90s, which is really outdated. So we know we need more updated guidance for cities. And we're also exploring related topics like annexation and the role of cities and counties when it comes to land that is being brought into the UGB. And then one other thing that I will note is that equity has been a key theme of this work as we are thinking about increasing data equity for cities doing this work, and also thinking about how we can create complete communities, prioritize affordability, and create housing choice for cities that need to grow up and or grow out to meet an identified housing need. I know that was a lot, so I'll leave that there for now, and I will hand it back to you, Ben. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, team. And so we do have some high-level questions that we're going to ask, and really kind of bringing that frame that Anita started with earlier today around the racial equity framework. But before we do that, Steve, I know you've had the opportunity to be with some of our Caltech technical advisory folks, and wanted to just create some space for you and those members to provide any other insights, reflections, or context before we dive into that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Faust with 3J Consulting, but also very lucky to have been facilitating the CowTAC, as Jenna mentioned, we call it, over the past period of time. I don't even know how many months it's been, but we're 15 meetings so far. And I think we have 4 of our CowTAC members with us here today. We have Brock, Sarah, Corey, and Ted. And before we open up this conversation to the larger group, we just wanted to invite you to maybe share a few quick thoughts or observations about the work that the group has done thus far, the topics we've covered, and the conversations that we've had. So anyone have anything that they want to share with the broader group about the work we've done to date?
Sarah, I know, I see you both on screen. You're both kind of looking at each other, but Sarah, jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to really thank staff and the other members of the CowTAC. I think it's been a just really eye-opening experience hearing different perspectives. I'm on the public utilities side of things, but hearing from developers and real estate, counties, city representatives, just some of the challenges that they're facing. I think we all have a clear, well, maybe not a clear understanding of the problems, but we've at least identified some of them. And also, I appreciate staff's willingness to, address whether it's through this rulemaking process or at least just kind of, identified some of the related issues that are kind of tangential to the CowTAC's primary task.
Yeah, thanks, Brock, jump in.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Kasara said at the end there. You know, there's a lot of layers of complexity and there's a lot of really, really unique conditions, depending on where you are in the state, whether you're coastal, whether you're in the valley, whether you're out in the east or in the south. So it might be, you know, that there's visually at least a lot of changes that might be needed. But just because of the layers of complexity in the existing system, that's why it might look like a lot more, just to accomplish a single goal. It might take multiple changes. So I would just say keep in mind that, you know, we're all working towards the same objective here of making sure that we get as much housing built as we can, and get people with roofs over their heads. So don't be scared. We're working hard. We got a great team on it, and hope to see some good results.
Love it. Don't be scared, folks. Good guidance, Brock. Corey, please.
Yeah, I think I'll mirror some of what's been shared. It's been a great group to work with. I think staff has been amazing. I think that for me, just for this group, for folks to hear, I think a recognition about the infrastructure issues and that barrier has been really germane and central. And so feeling like that point's really coming through and being heard. And I think part of how we get at these really tough issues is we really understand the issues and the problems that are leading to them. So that's been great. And I think like the paper capacity or the phantom capacity point has come up. But again, just like really great agreement that this is not something that serves any of us, anyone. And so how do we really try and run at that issue? So I think those have all been great. We've had a really great discussion about complete communities and how we actually get more kind of tangible on the ground results via these processes. Haven't sort of solved that, but it's been good thought exercise. And then just one thing I wanted to share with staff and with this group, we've really benefited from some fantastic case studies. So we've had people come in and talk about like real world examples around these issues. And so as we step into conversations with the RAC about this work, just want to flag that using some of those illustrative case studies that are coming from our communities all over the state, I think has just been a really great way for us all to sort of understand and see how these issues play out. So yeah, so just something for consideration in future conversations with the RAC that's really worked well in the CalTech. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I love that. Were there other TAC members? Ted, was that the last one?
Ted's the last one, at least that I saw. If I missed anybody, please raise your hand. I don't know if you have anything you want to share, Ted, but otherwise, oh, there he is.
No, I think everyone covered it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, though. I think the thing that's been striking is that the similarities around the state, but also some of the differences that jurisdictions are contending with. Environmental constraints are a big one out on the coast, is what I've learned. So just been interesting to hear that conversation.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from TAC or Steve? Anything else you want to add?
No, I think well said, and just wanted to give them that opportunity as we open this up to a broader discussion. Thank you. Oh, there's Brock.
Well, Brock and Beth, Brock, jump in, and Beth, we'll close with you. Yeah, Brock.
I was just going to say, I saw Alexandra come off camera. I didn't know if she had anything she wanted to say, but just wanted to flag it for you.
Okay.
No, I'm just finally home, so I can be on camera.
Okay.
Appreciate everybody else's comments. Fully agree. It's been a wonderful process to kind of jump into partway through.
That's great. Thank you. Beth, please.
So having done housing capacity analysis across the state, I want to mention that what we're tackling are some, what we'll call them challenges, some things that have been unclear for decades in the way that Oregon has been doing housing capacity analysis that I think will make the outcomes of the report, even absent anything else, more better. So, and these are common issues that you see all across the state, as other people have talked about.
All right, thanks, Beth. Well, I appreciate folks with that additional framing from the TAC. Karen, were you going to add something? You're off mute, or you just happen to be off mute.
No, I was just going to illustrate for RAC members broadly that kind of where we've been with our TAC are through several of the rules that pertain under Division 7, Division 8, around capacity, Division 24, around UGB amendments, looking into a little bit of Division 27 and 21. And we have so much more work that we haven't, believe it or not, after 15 meetings, we still have not reached with our TAC members around urban reserves and rural reserves, so that the RAC has an understanding of, we've covered the majority of the bulk of what our legislative direction and our LCDC charges, but there is a portion that we still need to address post legislative session that we haven't even broached yet. So it's a large body of work.
Right. Well, we're teeing it up, I guess, as Brock said, don't be scared. We're going to go in. It's a big body of work. But I really appreciate some of those reflections. And some of it is just how do we kind of achieve to production, but do so in a way that both confronts the complexity and the barriers and the things that get in the way with those principles that were so clearly laid out in the racial equity framework that really is an underpinning for this work. And I think that's really the connection to some of these questions that we'll be starting with, at least at a high level. The other thing that, Corey, you named that, maybe team, I'll ask us collectively to think about, because it does sound like it was helpful, at least for some of the TAC members, is to use some of those real world examples and storytelling as a way to get context for kind of what does this look like on the ground and how do we solve for some of the challenges that either jurisdictions or regions or specific cities are experiencing. So maybe something to come back to. And I'm going to look to our collective team here as we have this conversation. We have kind of two questions. One is, as cities plan for housing, how do we do so in a way that really aligns with those principles, right? Of complete communities, of not concentrating affluence, all these things that we've been talking about in terms of the legislative and kind of policy direction. How do you do so in an equitable way and really plan for and mitigate unintended consequences and the burdens, some of those things that Anita talked about, right? Some of the address historical inequities and the benefits and burdens and try to amplify opportunities for restorative justice and really create accountability. And then the second question around both areas inside of our urban growth boundaries and in these expansion areas, how do we not repeat the historically exclusive neighborhood patterns and instead, to the language, Corey, you used earlier, inclusive, complete neighborhoods to serve, diverse communities with a range of income levels, right? So Ellen just posted a link to a mural board. It's another mechanism if thoughts come up for folks, but really do want to start at this level. So how do we start having this conversation through this kind of racial equity framework, thinking about what we're trying to both accomplish and not replicate? And again, I'll invite my colleagues, both our consultant team, our DLCD team, and others, if you have additional context or need to jump in for how we might think about entering this conversation.
So I guess this is kind of to help, maybe a prompt to the group. And those of you like I have worked on UGB expansions. I've probably worked on at least 4 in my career. So with this new rulemaking, those of you that are familiar with Goal 14 and UGB expansion requirements, how is this going to look different than before? Those folks in the TAC, I know you've talked a lot of sort of things. So maybe there might be folks who you all talked about that, but are these rules going to look different than typical UGB expansions that we've seen in the past?
Brian, is that a come on camera because you're ready to jump in?
Sure. Why not jump in? I have had personal experiences in managing projects on multiple UGB expansions. And in my experience, if you're talking about trying to establish a more equitable balance of complete communities, invariably, in my observations, what will happen is that at the end of a process, typically you have multiple documents, they're all technical. It could be a housing capacity analysis, it could be a housing production strategy, it could be the UGB itself. They're very complex. And there are so many ways to appeal whatever product comes out of this process. And so therefore it's very sensitive to interests and groups that have the resources, the time, the energy to fight something that they don't particularly like in their backyard or in the part of town that they represent and typically live in, or for other interest groups to get involved as well. And that essentially the amount of assumptions that you have to make one way or the other, the ton of assumptions you have to make, the factual basis to substantiate those, anything you can do to make it easier to have fewer assumptions that you're going to have to make and substantiate, any way you can decrease the legal risk, I think could lead to more equitable outcomes. Because invariably what ends up happening is people who have the resources will fight anything that they don't necessarily like in their particular part of town, any kind of change. And so I just want to mention that the legal risk component of UGBs is one of the major reasons why communities themselves, they don't want to get into it. There's a big disincentive. It's a lot of resources, a very contentious project, and a lot of legal risk that can carry years worth of defending a legal case and litigating a legal case. So anything we can do to reduce the legal barriers, the legal risks, decrease the total number of assumptions you're having to make, strengthen the system so that we don't have to make so many assumptions and make them safe harbors, I think will lead to better outcomes, along with a whole bunch of other planner stuff that we can talk about. But this is just a first conversation. Just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Brock?
Yeah, and I'll tag on to Brian's piece there, particularly, regarding who was able to engage in this process. I was meeting with a representative of the African American Alliance for Home Ownership recently, talking about some legislation that's coming up next year. And one of the things that she mentioned, she was like, "This is great, right? But what are we doing about the ability for people to buy land?" Right? That accounts for a major, major portion of the existing wealth gap between white households and communities of color. Right? And she was very frustrated, and I totally understand where she's coming from, because there are a lot of ways where if you are well resourced, you can get involved in this process and say, hey, this isn't something that we want. If you're not as well resourced, it's a lot more difficult to be able to potentially leave your job for a couple hours to come in and talk about these things, right? Even though they're issues of extreme importance, both to you and or to your community. So I really want to hammer down on that point that that access to land ownership is a major, major equity issue. And so, in addition to all the legal complexities that come forward with doing a UGB amendment in one form or another, as Brian so eloquently described, it is a major equity concern as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brock. I mean, I'm wondering if just unpacking some of that in and of itself, right? So when we say grow in equitable way, I'm curious what comes up for folks, or when we say unintended consequences, like, do we have some shared language or shared understanding of kind of what comes up for folks, particularly in the context of UGB expansion? Like, I guess, when you think about both development outside of a UGB, when you think about urbanization inside the UGB, like, what does it mean to do that in an equitable way? Karen?
Yeah, I thought I might steal a page from Shannon's book. I think Shannon Billhauser, you're here with you. I think, I'm gonna apologize if I get this wrong, but I believe you've served on the NAPTAC. We've asked other members of other technical advisory committees to come visit our advisory committee. And what Shannon did with our community members was illustrate and depict a picture within the system of a hospital of, who do we need to run this hospital? What does that look like as far as a community and a system of healthcare? And it was really interesting because I think the most obvious is you would hope to have a doctor in a hospital. But what was a list of needs of personnel and individuals in a hospital was anywhere from your security to your food service to your ambulance EMT drivers to your building facilities maintenance. All these folks are needed within that system of healthcare. And do we have housing for all those folks that can be affordable, right? And so I think the question I would ask of this group, when you think about housing all the essential workers in your community, do you think of the UGB expansion area, that newly added land at the edge of a city? Do you think, oh, that is where we will get our new affordable housing? It's coming, and it will come there. As well as within the city, how do we accommodate it, use the land as most efficiently as possible within our city, but we also believe it will come there. Or I might challenge this group, is there a perception, and has there been a historical trend of outcomes that, oh, that new land is being added to our UGB, it will be developed. Yeah, but that housing isn't for me. I work as a food service industry worker. I will never see anything that's affordable to me out there. Nor is it a community that's accessible to me that's going to meet my needs in the sense of a complete community.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Shannon, did you want to add anything?
Just sending appreciation. Thank you for bringing that forward. I think that if I could just like a soft point to add into that analogy is like, we do want the doctors and senior hospital administrators to live in the community too, right? Like having those high net worth homes is going to bring up property values and shore up the tax base and ensure that everybody gets access to good schools. Like what we're trying to move away from is like, this is where all the doctors and senior administrators live, and here's where everyone lives who works the less compensated jobs at night, right? We're trying to spread that opportunity like throughout all of those essential workers within the system. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you both. So how does that happen? I mean, I think that's, maybe I'm misinterpreting the second question, but ultimately, right, like in that description, right, Shannon, where it's an inclusive and complete neighborhood, like how does that happen? What are some of the challenges? What gets in the way? I mean, Brian, you named some of the just legal risk and NIMBYism and other challenges that come through the legal realm, but how do we do this, right? This is kind of the grappling with that high level question. Alan, jump in.
Thanks, Ben, and others. I think one of the things I'll say, and we saw it in the recent legislation that opened up sort of, for a better way of framing it, these automatic UGB expansions for cities, and which some cities are moving forward with at this point. And I think the way we do it is with intentionality. And we saw that in that piece of legislation around the requirement around affordability in those expansion areas, right? And so, I think the framework for that is intentionality, and the framework that we have around racial justice. How we do that becomes the real question, because the tension we have is how do we do it right in a way that doesn't stifle development, that doesn't create other unintended consequences. So it's exactly the question you asked, but the piece that we've inserted, I think that we haven't had in the past, is this intentionality around those three legs around production, affordability, and choice. But those are three very big dials to adjust, and that's the work in front of us. But we weren't adjusting those dials before. We weren't even paying attention to most of those other dials before, and that's what's gotten us into the situation we have. So we have to do that now, and it does make it at least 3 times as complicated, but if not infinitely more. So that's both as my usual. It's both an answer and a question. So.
Yeah. Shannon, were you going to add? I saw a human hand kind of come up there.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be so quick. I see your hand, Brock, as well. I mean, this is where I'm so excited for adoption ready actions and strategies, and like, how do we do it? What are the things? What are the tools, right? And really appreciated as a guest the chance to hear about annexations as well, which I don't think I hear about as frequently. And I'm just going to state the obvious, which kind of goes to your earlier point as well, Brock, of land banking, having land, right? in high opportunity areas of our existing communities, like where can we accommodate some higher density, affordable and market rate units? Where do we work those in to a forthcoming housing development that we know our community is planning land, right? It's really key. Thanks.
Brock?
Yeah, and I'll kind of provide a little bit of one possible answer to the question that Commissioner Lazo posed. And in addition to having the requirements for affordability, right, which we're happy to see, I want to and tie this into what Brian said as well. Kind of the demonstration of need, right? One of the other components of that UGB expansion portion, right, in addition to having that 30% affordability requirement, is also that you have to have your city has to have a higher proportion of rent burden than the state does as a whole. If any of you have read the 2024 State of the State Housing Report from OHCS, if you haven't, please do. It's the most terrifying report I've ever seen come out of a state agency. One portion in particular, out of the very, very many, is that more than 27% of all renters are severely cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on housing. I don't know why we have to preclude housing development if more than a quarter of our population is a car accident, a medical bill, another high cost random issue, act of God, whatever you want to call it, from ending up on the street, from losing their home, or maybe even not ending up on the street, but having to go and live with family or with friends when they weren't anticipating to, right? These are very, very thin lines that people can cross over quite easily. And so when we're talking about the need to justify determination for more land, right? I don't think we want to set the bar so high that a quarter of our community needs to be a step away from catastrophe before we do something about it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brock. Other thoughts? But obviously we have questions here, but you've heard, a number of comments, constraints, barriers, opportunities, vision. I guess what's coming up for Alexandra? Jump in.
Sorry, I clicked off mute and then realized I should have raised my hand. I think, coming from city's perspective, we're all kind of ready and willing to do this work. I know, last Thursday, they took their first steps forward towards that UGB expansion. And I think when we talk about how to ensure that we're meeting the goals that we set, what Brock brought up contributes to a lot of it, that is terrifying. And I think it speaks to kind of the exact complexity and the exact just like need of layering that we're talking about when we're looking at these expansion areas. Most of them are not going to be perfect. We're going to try to, get it right, if the right connections to infrastructure, the right connections to transit, but it's not only going to be a housing conversation at the end of the day when it comes to our cities and, the Oregonians who live there. It's going to be the water that goes to it. It's going to be the, making sure it connects to a transit line. It's going to be making sure that we, as folks working at the state level, are working to kind of build this complete system around it as we expand and try to build more housing for folks. So it's not just housing. And I say that as a housing lobbyist.
Thank you, Alexandra. Well, speaking of Bend, Brian.
So just a couple thoughts. So there are a few questions kind of on the table for discussion. One was around how do you create those complete and affordable housing opportunities? And, what can we do as a RAC, and how can the rules change to accommodate that? And, if we're looking at, you have infill and then you have expansion, it's just those two kind of bookends. And the infill situation, I think fair to say you can look at high opportunity areas within your city, areas that have demographic, social characteristics, land values, a ton of amenities, and you can make a change there. And what I mentioned previously about legal risk is when a city makes that change, there's typically a legal risk associated with that because of the areas that you're operating within. And there are folks typically with resources, time, energy, and sophistication to fight that kind of effort, a well-intended effort by a city. So I think that's one tool. The other, in that situation, if you're taking land that's at a market value now, say you're using it for lower density housing, it would naturally go through the market mechanisms to something that's kind of single unit detached, high end, and you say, let's rezone that, let's redesignate that. This area is complete, it's ready to go, this is beautiful. What we're going to do is we're going to rezone that for, just call it mixed use, multi-story housing with an affordability component. You may actually be subject to a legal challenge from the property owner, in addition to the surrounding neighbors. And so those are real factors that play out at the local level. And for those local practitioners, you know that well. And then in expansion, we just completed the first action. The city council made a decision on pursuing and selecting a site for the one-time UGB addition. And I think an example of how that can be done in a way that creates less harm and more opportunity is in the discussion with council, we look at serviceability. One site tended to be more serviceable and faster to the market. That same site had deeper levels of affordability commitment, including some 30% area median income, 80% area median income, up to 130% area median income. We presented slides on that. Also, the context of that site. So looking at the context, it's right next to a couple schools. It's right next to emerging commercial areas. So an additional development down here could help support that, provide really good access to amenities for that new UGB expansion area. And also we took a look at concentrations of poverty and locations of existing affordable housing and ended up picking a site that had less concentrations of poverty, less concentrations of affordability in an area that was relatively well amenitized. But I know from personal discussions from folks who were there, many people after that hearing were talking about, how do I appeal this thing? How can I appeal this? But as you know, that particular law has an appeal right only to the city and only to the applicant and the site owner. And so I think I'm just sharing these things as kind of the mechanisms that occur in the real world, at least our world in Bend. I hope your worlds are different, that affect this conversation.
I appreciate that, Brian, and my luxury of being a layperson is I get to ask these type of questions. Like, so is that just a reality or is that changeable? Like, how is that just a context that we have to operate in, right? That what's appealable, right? The reality that resource populations are going to resist things that they don't want in their neighborhood, right? Is that just a reality that we have to operate within, or is that something that can be changed?
I would say that it is something that's always on the mind of a legal team that is working with the city or for a city. It's always on the mind of staff. Can it be changed? I'm sure it can be changed. It may take legislative action. I'm not sure if it can happen through rulemaking. But I don't want to call it a reality. That's a little presumptuous. It's just something that we live with. We live with here. I assume others live with it too.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I appreciate that. Anita?
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. UGBs are expansions are contentious. Part of the equity kind of pillars that we have there is one question related to what are some things that are actually outside kind of the authority and jurisdiction of, LCDC. Because also, like you said, some of this may require legislation or other sorts of things. So I think we're actually asking you all to think big. I mean, that is the reality. And like I said, it's evolved over the years, Brian. I have to say, I worked on the UGB in Bend back in 1989. So it's been going on a long time. And so, and it has evolved a lot, but it has gotten probably more litigious. And so what are some things that, thinking bigger, not that there's some opportunity to do it because this is really an important topic in a crisis.
Thank you both for that. Maddie, you had raised a hand.
There are others that want to speak. I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to offer just perhaps a follow-on to Brian's comments. Thank you, Anita, for sharing your perspective as well. what we find sometimes is that cities, there's a will, there's a collective will to identify opportunities not dissimilar from what Brian stated. Like there's an area of opportunity. We see the vacant land or the partially vacant land or the redevelopment opportunity in a place, a complete neighborhood, and we'd really like to make an opportunity for more affordable housing in this neighborhood. But for these exogenous pressures that he described, the sophisticated energy, as it were, without naming too many negative things. And I think what we're hoping to find is that there are places where rules can provide a backstop to cities to prevent or limit the exposure that they have to take in order to advance something that they know is needed. So I don't want to steer the conversation too hard in a different direction, but just know that for all of those things that were highlighted that are, what Brian and other community development directors throughout the state have to wrestle with, there are ways that we at DLCD in our rulemaking process might be able to provide some relief or some backstop, just in the same way that we did around housing types in recent rulemaking a few years ago, and we will make in subsequent rulemaking, that perhaps if we can identify what those things are, there's a pathway forward that's a little less, it's less at the forefront of that fire, and it's in the background, that we can just provide you with some support in a meaningful way to make those efforts more successful. So just for the group's edification, that's what we're hoping to discover in our technical advisory committee process, and we're hoping that you all as advisory committee members can help us highlight.
Yeah, that's great, Maddie. Thank you for just naming it in the way that you did, and Anita challenging this group to think big, right? And I think those two things go hand in hand. And what are the ways that rules can serve as that relief or backstop as we have these conversations, understanding kind of some of the ways that some of what gets in the way, right? And I sometimes describe it, are they hurdles or are they walls? And hurdles you can jump over or go around, walls you bang into, but that's our collective imagination for you all. Let's go Ted and then Shane.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I don't have a solution at my fingertips, but I do think there's a tension here. A lot of the work that's been happening in the last several years around Goal 10 planning has really added layers of complexity. And some of that trickles into urban growth management decisions. And so I think this gets to Brian's point. We are finding ourselves needing to make more and more assumptions about housing markets in the future. And each time we do that, it introduces new risk for us with potential litigation, because there's not a correct answer in a lot of the work that we do. So reasonable people can disagree. And so maybe that's a path forward. Some additional clarity around the fact that there is not necessarily a correct answer on many of the things that we have to define in growth management decisions.
Thanks for that. Shane?
Oh, thank you. I'll try to condense this. There's just a lot of thoughts swirling in the air. So when it comes to specifically the question regarding urbanization within an urban growth boundary, in my life, I've probably lived in so many manner different places, from like a population of 20,000 and then mostly in the Portland metro region. And then in the Portland metro region, because of how many times I've moved, I've lived in the inner city, the fringes that are kind of there, then a suburban context and a more rural context. So that's my framework, and just trying to also have it from a class perspective, because I feel that there are more realities in the United States and events recently occurring that are bringing up class conversation issues. And so I guess when I think big, part of the framework that we have to consider is that it's not just local desire, it is future residents, right? There's current residents and future residents. And in my experience, there can be future residents that are either renters and they're straining a limited rental market. They have enough capital to get one home, and then they're adding costs to the homeownership market. And then thirdly, there's the class of people who are financializing land and properties within that limited market. All of those strains end up happening where, for example, I remember Powellhurst Gilbert, which is like a more fringe inner city neighborhood in Portland. As there's more bike lanes and the trees are put in, it has the whispers of urbanization. But at the end of the day, the time it's going to take to make that a complete neighborhood will end up being so long that the national market pressure and local market pressures for just market rate rents have already increased dramatically. They can increase dramatically in one season, let alone a year or 2 years. That may take the time to get a building to happen there. So just on a granular cultural level, I feel like there is a lot of resentment and envy building within cities across Oregon State because people are witnessing that people who may have more capital or at a higher class structure have access to stability, which means not being forced to move. Secondly, a certain amount of beauty. And in Portland or Oregon, that means access to nature, mature trees, beautiful architecture. And thirdly, it ends up being just the time to be able to intersect and integrate with the culture surrounding you. And that has to do with the grid framework, which also has to do with cities, suburban, and rural. So I'm just thinking big in the sense that there are large frameworks in terms of auto dependency, class structures, overall financialization of the housing market, and then many more people moving to the Northwest because of environmental or economic reasons. So that's just my big perspective. When it comes to thinking big in terms of a will aspect, I will speak more directly that I think it's unconscionable and immoral that people who already have home ownership and access to beautiful cultural amenities could use any process to delay housing in any aspect. Like, we do not have time to screw around. And the amount of times that I have been displaced from inner city to inner outer to outer to outer to suburban to rural, I end up seeing that if you don't have ownership and you don't have stability somewhere, then that just ends up creating more chaos and more disorder, which ends up creating more instability in the community and more resentment. So it's really just trying to find the constant framework of, regardless of our local thinking and our local decision making, the ground is shifting under our feet almost on a day-by-day basis. And I guess that's what I can offer. And then in terms of a solution, it's really just trying to focus on the granular analysis of, by income and by certain class status, are you able to afford this neighborhood? If you make this income, it will be unlikely. If you make this income, it is likely. And by doing that granular analysis and then creating visualization and data models to model, say, a certain kind of zoning. If there was only dense zoning in the available land, this is potentially the amount of housing, but also the potential amount of infrastructure cost. And I just think showing those scales and potential roads may help cities who have limited funding and limited access to data sometimes have a more of a framework that they're not having to work so hard to find all that information themselves. And so I know that was a lot of random stuff, but this is such a large conversation and sometimes it's just hard to hold it all in.
That's great. Thank you, Shane. And just bringing in, both that your own personal kind of journey of different space and geographies, but I think this bigger tension, of course, between kind of urbanization and areas of opportunity, relationships to displacement and stability. And folks, you didn't use this word, but kind of hoarding those spaces of opportunity and resisting at all costs, allowing others into it. So just appreciate that, Karen.
Yeah, I was going to add, building off of what Shane shared with us is I think about this from multiple perspectives. I think many of you know that I started my career 20 years ago working for a culturally specific affordable housing developer, a community development corporation. And so when I think about it from the practice of a municipal planner and planners really striving every day in and out to plan for both their current residents and future residents. But there's a lot of unknowns from that perspective of a planner trying to apply the code. And I think of what Brian says, that we're looking for this backstop, as Maddie called it, of fewer assumptions, and maybe that's more safe harbors. And this is certainly not the first rulemaking process to endeavor down the road. of providing that backstop through safe harbors in Division 24. Division 38 was created entirely almost for that reason. But I think about what planners need, what we know and what we don't know. And I hearken back to my background in affordable housing of what do developers need? And we have such a body of wisdom here in this group. And I look at, Victor from Bienestad. I look at Rachel from NOAA and knowing the financing mechanisms of what affordability means to put all those pieces together in that financial stack. Shannon at Habitat for Humanity, who has chapters all across the state. I think I see Salem Housing Authority. We have a representative here. And it's an opportunity to marry those two and say, we understand the process as it exists for an urban growth boundary expansion, but how might we realign that process to achieve certain outcomes that are now required by ONA as we respond to a housing need allocation by income level for those community members, particularly those who are at risk of housing instability and displacement. And I think, Commissioner Lazo, you've often presented on marrying that goal 10 housing work with these goal 14 land use processes that we know of. And I think that's what's before us here today is an opportunity to do that. It's no easy task. It's no light lift. And there's a lot of complexity, but I wanted to point out the expertise in the room. And they come from very different backgrounds.
Thank you for that. Brock?
Yeah, and to build on what Karin just said, I think there's a couple, examples that we can bring into that as well, some of which we've discussed during the CowTac. And Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong when I say this, but I remember you saying this earlier. The Division 38 rules, have existed, I think, since 2015, but they've never been used for a residential UGB expansion because of the complexity that's involved in that, right? Think about that. The simplified method has never been used because it's too complex. That alone is a huge statement, right? There's another project for about 40 lots that could be developed into housing going on in Salem. But because of the tree code, about half of those lots are not buildable because the trees would have to be removed because you're encroaching into the critical root zone. The developer just backed out of that project. Those are 40 lots that we could build housing on, whether they're single family homes or whether they're quadplexes, right? So anywhere between 40 and 160 units gone because our BLI is off. It doesn't account for the fact that those trees aren't going to be able to be removed and that development can't happen, right? And then there's, another project in my city, I literally, a 5-minute walk from where I live, right? And the developer's on board, the property owners are on board, but the city hasn't brought the land in, even though they could do it through the 1537 process. They meet their needs triggers for it. They could do that, but it hasn't been approved. And so I think, and however that speaks to you, it speaks to you. But I think what it indicates at a broad spectrum is that across the state, there are a lot of barriers to being able to turn land into housing. Most exemplified by the fact that the simplified method has never been used because it's too complex.
I'm going to sit with that quote, Brock, for a long time. So I appreciate that you naming it in that way. And I'm curious. I know, team. One of the kind of sub questions that we thought about coming into this is kind of where might more education be helpful. And when I hear those examples, Brock, or I hear Corey, you talking earlier about some of the storytelling that gave some illustration to what we're trying to solve for. I guess I'm curious, just as a group, if there's things that, we're going to have several months now between this meeting and the next time this RAC comes together. And I'm curious if there's resources, education, supports, and other kind of tools that might be helpful for folks to engage in the conversation, because I don't know where everybody is in this. Shane, why don't you jump in? And then I am curious if folks have ideas for what would be helpful. Yeah, Shane.
Oh, great. Thank you. And I promise this sounds silly, but it's not a flippant suggestion, which is when people were talking, it just occurred to me. It's like, is there a Smokey Bear, but for housing growth? Because for me, at the end of the day, and I'm sorry if that sounds silly, but my reason for stating that is that we live in a very deeply emotional world right now, and those emotions are affected by people's lived conditions and whether they have access to community or not. I know that in my own struggling to find community for myself, there's a lot of times that just within the friendships I've made or the people I've connected in advocacy, there are many, many times that my own dis-ease and sadness related to not having housing availability has very much increased my my poverty consciousness and my crabs in a barrel syndrome. So I can understand from a lower class level, sorry, not low class, but a working class level, disabled people, people who are not served by the economic system. We have so many market pressures on an individual, local, regional, and national basis. So having some kind of entity or mascot to speak directly to people and maybe pairing that with qualitative stories. Like, I don't even know if the media income is possible to support this, but I just think there are so many disparate conversations about what housing is. And if there was like a little baby sixplex building and then a developer with a hard hat, and then there's a homeless person, and they're all able to like have a community conversation at a cartoon level of very disparate ideas, but people can see the realities that all of them express. Because at the end of the day, we're all animists. We believe that wills and energies are behind things. So if we use image data, especially since such an image-based culture with TikTok, Instagram, and other media technologies, and much more of a playful environment, I think we can cajole people into considering that this is a deeply emotional topic for many important reasons. And if we personalize that and put a little face on there with little cute uwu cheeks on a sixplex, I just think there's ways to tell people there's entirely different ways to envision housing and doing it in a way that is playful and down on a person-to-person basis.
Well, I love it. Well, Shane, I just, just always appreciate you humanizing this conversation, and personalizing it, but humanizing it in a way that I think is really helpful for us to be able to hold. And love the idea. I'm thinking about the tagline, only you can prevent housing instability or houselessness, whatever that ends up being. But, I also just appreciate, right, what it will take to get to, we talk about thinking big or being creative, using imagination, trying different ways of thinking about how we resolve these issues. And I just love the way you just illustrated that. Beth, jump in.
I completely agree with what Shane just said. Having been the analyst behind a lot of work that's gone on over the years, I can say that facts don't meet everybody. There are cities who have tried to do this, maybe not in cute, humorous ways, but in like really forthright, genuine ways. Like Beaverton did a Beaverton Voices report some years ago that I found very affecting. Occasionally, we've tried to bring in information about, what is it that people who work in your community, what can they afford? And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think another tool in our toolbox should well be things that are much more qualitative and emotional in a lot of ways. It's just not the way that the Oregon system has been set up. It's set up to be fact-based and rational, as though we're rational creatures.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And just the examples that some of that has existed, right? And there's different ways to, and we do a lot of work in, in this kind of role, trying to get folks out of their kind of self-interest based corners into a broader shared based interest perspective. And there's a lot of shared vision and emotion and storytelling that helps get folks into that space. And so I appreciate that example. And Shane, your challenge to us to kind of think, how do we get those folks that are the NIMBYs out of that shared individual interest into a more collective and shared interest? And that's, certainly a challenge, but I would say an opportunity for this group to be thinking about. Any thoughts? This has been really helpful. Brock, jump in.
Oh, I was just going to say, building on Shane's idea, is that something that DLCD could do as like a public input process? You know how like they'll do the thing where like, the kid creates the like I voted sticker. I don't know if you guys saw the one with like the werewolf like ripping off his shirt that was in Minnesota this year. Like if we could do something like that, right? Like send it out, like let all the school age children, put together, a housing mascot, right? And, you could do it at no cost, right? More or less.
We'll put that on Ethan's to-do list. I mean, so I don't know if you want to respond in the moment, but I will capture that, right, and Brock, and I think that's just the type of creativity, right, that trying to think about as we think about these very specific kind of technical conversations that we're going to have, not losing the bigger picture, right? What is that broader narrative? What is the kind of community collective voice that is going to help us as a state talk about and humanize and bring a more collectivist way of thinking about it. Let's go, Alexandra, Maddie, Shannon.
Not to speak out of turn while they're not here, but I do know that OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, which is the state's housing finance agency, has collected, or at least been working on collecting, a lot of kind of human narrative stories to kind of bring into the conversation as they're working on their advocacy, both kind of with Oregonians, in terms of journalism, things like that, but also when kind of talking to legislators and local elected officials. And, they've seen kind of very positive impact. And I know it's a little bit harder on kind of the DLCD side where you're not maybe, building the developments, you're more kind of distanced from it on the land use side, but something to kind of consider in terms of integration of lived experience narrative. I personally love the idea of a little sixplex with eyes, but I really want to center kind of the lived experience aspect of it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon.
Thanks. I think I want to take a moment to just say some things I've observed in my time as an affordable housing advocate. And also, again, so much appreciation to Karen and Jenna and the invitation to join the CATAC and the patients with talking about who works at the hospital among the group. Part of why I did that is because I've noticed that when you say the term affordable housing, people go, and unfortunately, like I don't want that to be the way the world is, and I see it to be the way the world is. So along with this idea of narrative and storytelling, it's part of why I like that phrase, complete communities. And I hear other phrases that I know of that work well, of workforce housing, and the unseen houseless members of our community who are doubled up in homes and senior women sleeping in cars. I think that how do we keep people from throwing that wall up the minute we walk into a room? How do we start thinking constructively together about the fact that we want, of course, in a thriving community, people from different walks of life and different kinds of jobs and vocations and levels of income and times of life are going to need a place to live. How do we get to that, of course, conversation more quickly? Unfortunately, it takes great care sometimes. Thanks.
No, thank you, Shannon. Well, I've appreciated this conversation, and again, we're going to be separated by several months coming out of this conversation to the next time we come together, and this feels like a really good energy to kind of close and to hold as we go from this date into the 2025 into the new year. It pains me even to say that out loud. It feels wild how quick time goes. But really just appreciate folks' energy and vision around that. I'm curious what the Kid Governor's platform is, so we might have to connect with Kid Governor and see if we can get her to start talking about housing for everyone. So we'll keep the creative juices moving as we go forward. But I guess I'll just open it up for any last thoughts, particularly if we haven't heard from you. Just want to offer some last space for folks. Otherwise, we can kind of start moving into next steps. And then maybe I'll ask Anita or DLCD team or Alan if you have any reflections just on the conversation we just had or anything that you'd like to share coming out of this, because we won't be coming together now for a couple of months. So if there's any reflections or on what you just heard. See you all looking at each other. Anita, jump in, please.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to encourage folks to just think broadly. I know it's, folks in particular working in local government, it's hard being in the trenches and the politics and all the work. So, this is your opportunity to think about the system. Some of this may not happen, but definitely how are we going to do this differently? How are we going to make this housing need that we have that is so urgent happen? And so again, we're going to probably continue to ask you things, even though things that are outside the jurisdiction of the LCD and LCDC, but thinking bigger just to start that conversation. Land ownership, the last time we heard about building codes, heard about taxing, other sorts of things like that, I think are just really good food for thought as well as we move through, because I think we're going to have to really look at all kinds of ways to get this done. This is just one piece. And so encouraging all just to stay in there with us on this.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. Kathleen and then Brian.
The lawyer in me, its reaction to things like appealability of UGB or zoning changes, my initial response is let's get the legislature to pass a law to prevent the appeal, to prevent some of this discrimination from stopping us. I've worked in fair housing for years, and it's the fact that I've got a law behind me that allows me to do things like stop people from discriminating, stop people from not constructing accessible housing when the feds require it. So it's helpful for me to hear people think that it might be possible to do it another way than having to pass laws, but I just haven't seen it in my 50 years of experience. So I'd love to see what we can come up with, or maybe we do need to go to the legislature.
Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate you just sharing that history. And right, I think our first attempt is to Maddie's comments earlier, right? How do we kind of explore rules to be able to create that backstop and try to address where some of the barriers show up, and of course not thinking or not limiting ourselves only to the confines of the rules that we have in front of us. Brian, you had a hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple thoughts as we begin a new journey. It's an extension of an old journey. On just reflecting from the last year. Couple thoughts. One, I would just me. I think it would be awesome for staff to, as soon as you start thinking about different changes to rules, to put out the drafts of the rules sooner. So rough ideas, if you're you're toying with rules and different formats, and there's a lot of changes and a lot of rules. In order to avoid a situation where kind of like at the end with a month or two left, we get hit with a mountain of new rules. And I think, as we know, it's really tough to make changes at that point, given these really strict deadlines. So I think just maybe imploring staff to take a bit of a risk, throw it at us, let's talk about it. So if there's some really good structural changes you're making, we can get on board quickly. And if there's some things that meet with a lot of questions and concern, we can address those as well. And the second just thought process suggestion, I saw Beth Goodman on Echo Northwest. I think they do a really good job. And I've seen some presentations that they've given on kind of the economics and fundamentals of housing from an economic standpoint, from a developer standpoint, which is how most of the housing we're talking about will get produced. So I would love it if there's any room in the scope of work, in the contract, to have Echo really teach us, train us up, to let us know what those factors are, that will help us understand the economy that we're dealing with when it comes to public, the public infrastructure piece, land policy, and how this all plays out on the back end so that we can get the front end rules right. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Brian. You're raising, something that could be really helpful over, as we do take this kind of interim break, both process suggestions, right? So getting materials, drafts out earlier, any other process that's going to help you engage more fully. And then if there's additional types of information, so that example around, Echo providing some kind of economic analysis to help our conversations, I would kind of collectively ask the group to think about those things that you might need. So when we get into the spring, we really, you all feel like you can engage in the most full way. Alexandra? Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
I'm unraised my hand instead of unmuting. It's a learning curve today. I just really wanted to underline kind of the getting things out kind of as early as possible and being able to give feedback as much as possible. I think as we look at kind of limited capacity, and especially knowing that, we're going into legislative season and we're going to be having bills that folks are needing to give feedback on, and all of that, just kind of as much time as you possibly can. And I know sometimes you're on tight timelines, but just as clear of expectations as we can set for what the timelines are, what kind of feedback you're looking for, kind of those kind of complete as we can in processes like these, kind of information about what it is you're looking for. I can offer myself, and I know, other association folks can, provide support in that, because, capacity is limited, but, as much as that's possible, it really is so appreciated. Cannot emphasize that enough.
Great. Thank you, Alexandra. So let's go, Karen, and then Ethan, I'll have you close this out.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I see we're at time here, but I want to take to heart what I just heard, and I think we're going to take you up on that offer. So, Alexandra, you've put an offer on the table, but I want to ante up on that. There are at least 9 members that are in this room, folks who serve on this Rules Advisory Committee, that are also our TAC member committees. And in our heads, I have our project team here, 3J with Steve Faust and Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest, that in our heads, we were due at the end of the month to give very broad concepts to our project team of where we see amendments and revisions to rulemaking. We had not envisioned giving those to our TAC membership in the months of January and February. And maybe that is your first glimpse. Here's our robust sort of broad stroke, the concepts that we're putting together. We'll vet those through and work through them with Beth and Steve. We get them to you earlier rather than later. And then maybe to the broader rack, if you all are interested in seeing how very draft language is shaping up around March or April, we can make a commitment to get that out to a broader audience than we had originally anticipated. So I'm going to take that to heart. We'll go back to the drawing board, restructure a little bit of our planning. Ethan, sorry for those extra couple minutes there.
So thanks, Karen. Well, I'm seeing nodding heads and hearts popping up, so I think you're getting some positive reflection back on that commitment. Well, let's go, Ethan. You want to talk about next steps? And I know we've been letting folks know we wouldn't be meeting for a while, but why don't you talk about next steps and start closing us out here?
Yeah, thank you everyone for the discussion. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. So I'll go through this real quick, recognizing we're already over 3 o'clock, which we promised we'd get you out by. But a couple upcoming things just to note here. We've got, like we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation in the meeting today, We've got the Housing Actions Work Group meeting for the first time, just to do an orientation, a ground, a level setting on what we're actually talking about, what the scope of work entails, and a kind of work plan for that group. That'll be on December 18th. Those will function very similarly to a technical advisory committee in terms of like the meeting logistics. The meetings will be recorded and provided and all of those kind of things. So if you're not a member of that work group, you can follow along. And then we'll also come back to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee throughout the process to provide updates. The 2024 ONA rules are effective starting January 1st. It's kind of the big day of ushering in the new ONA paradigm. Rules effective, the production and equity indicators, and the housing production targets and allocations all published on January 1st or thereabouts. And we're going to take a break for the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We're going to pause between now and we'll come back in April of 2025. Part of that is because what you just heard from Karin about kind of drafting the actual rule language. We'll take a break from meetings to do that actual drafting. And oh, by the way, there's a legislative session in there that starts on the 21st of January. So we're going to pause there while that legislative session kind of really gets going, and we'll come back and see you all in April 2025. In the interim, feel free to reach back out to staff and plug in those ways, the technical advisory committees, the Housing Actions Work Group, or just send us an email, get in touch. We're happy to have those conversations, and it's truly informative to drafting rules. And we'll come back in April with something more for you to chew on, something actually tangible for you to chew on. So we're looking forward to that in April. Thank you all so much for the discussion today and for really over the past year. Super appreciated. And I hope you can all see your comments and reflections and feedback in the 2024 rules, and we continue that in 2025. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ethan. Thanks, everybody. However you celebrate holidays or the transition into the new year, much love as you do, and we'll see you in 2025. Appreciate everybody. Take care.